Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this session, Localised Routes to Market, Understanding the Community Benefits of Local Organic Food. I'm Adrian Steele, Organic Farmer and Organic Sector Development Advisor for the Soil Association, and I have virtually with me Julie Brown, who runs Growing Communities in Hackney, London, which is a social enterprise set up in 1996 to transform food and farming through community-led trade, and Christian Giacorini, who is Senior Consultant from the New Economics Foundation. Christian's expertise lies in policy research, and he is NEF's lead on social returns on investment, and is passionate about promoting a holistic view of value so that people and planet are at the heart of decision-making. We've been able to work together thanks to funding from Farming the Future Collective, which works to foster collaborative action to help transform the food and farming system for the better. We would particularly like to thank Robert Reed for his support. Our collaboration grew out of a shared sense of frustration with the way that food is priced without regard to its true value. Julie and I were continually hearing the argument that agroecological food production is too expensive, and that's why it would always remain as a niche. We were sure that if all the environmental and social outcomes were taken into account, then there would be a very different story to tell. It is heartening that this approach is being picked up in public policy now, thanks to the principle of public payments for public goods becoming embedded in DEFRA's policy. We wanted to provide a real-life example of the true value of organic food that people are buying as we speak in London, so that they can see the true benefits that they are buying with their food. We also wanted the policymakers to become aware that alternative routes to market and organic farming are far more efficient than they were assuming. Assumption is the mother of all cock-ups, and we are pleased to say that our findings demonstrate just that. We were fortunate enough to be able, through the Farming the Future, to commission Christian at New Economics Foundation to analyse the Growing Communities model and to monetise the value that it delivers to society, the economy, and the environment. Time is short, so I would like to hand over to Julie now.
Thanks, Adrian. I think, has my slideshow gone up? I don't know. Do I need to do something? That's not a very good start, is it?
You're doing great, Julie. If you can just make it so. Yep, there you go. Perfect. Now right. You are good to go.
Okay, I'm calm and collected now.
If you do me one more favor, if you hover over where it says Streamyard is sharing your screen, if you can click hide, then it'll just make it a little bit cleaner for everybody to see. Okay. Perfect. You're good to go. Have a great presentation.
Great. Thank you. A smoothly honed machine there from me. Anyway, okay, so we started this research project back in pre-pandemic times. So it inevitably got held up along the way, and we'd almost given up on us actually finishing it. So I'm really happy to be here to be able to share the results with you. While I'm really sad not to be in Oxford itself, and I'm missing seeing lots of friends and colleagues, but I'm also really enjoying this new format, apart from slide cock-ups. And the opportunity that it's providing for so many people from around the world to be able to be here and to share their perspectives and their experiences. So I guess that part of what Growing Communities wanted from this research was to be able to confirm the evidence of our own eyes, really, to prove that after 25 years working to make the food and farming system more sustainable, we were in our small way on the right track. So when the initial findings came through, Christian speculated that the Growing Communities model, I've lost my slide. There you go, is more efficient than industrial agriculture, which I put an exclamation mark up because actually what this made me feel like was that. I know there's a lot of a debate and disagreement about what efficiency actually means and whether it's even the right way to be thinking about our food and farming system. But I must admit to feeling a certain, possibly childish thrill that this study might show that what we were doing was actually better than the mainstream food system. So, but efficiency aside, I mean, what do we want from our food and farming system? Arguably, these are the things: climate and nature-friendly food production, decent and healthy food for all, and an engaged and empowered and skilled and decently paid population who are willing and able to feed themselves well. And I believe that this study shows that we are indeed delivering on all of those things. And while, as I say, we're small in the grand scheme of things, I'd also argue that we do this a lot better than the supermarket-driven system, which is currently failing to deliver on pretty much all of these outcomes. Anyway, on that slightly provocative note, and before I hand over to Christian to tell us more about what the research actually does say, I'd like to give you a quick overview of what Growing Communities does in a more practical sense. So this is us. There's 32 of us. We work 18 mainly part-time, but 18 full-time equivalent. We're established in 1996. We're based in Hackney in East London. Our overall turnover is around 2.5 million. And in terms of our aims, as I said, we're working to help build a fairer, more sustainable food system that looks after people, the soil, and our planet. And we bring together our Hackney community to provide farmer-focused routes to market that work for the organic small-scale producers that we believe should be the foundation of such a sustainable system. The routes to market that we utilise are a fruit and vegetable box scheme, which supplies around 1,400 customers a week, and a weekly organic farmers market, which attracts another 1,500 weekly customers. And we work with around 30 sustainable farmers and processors. And at the last count, we were supplying around 4% of the fresh veg in Hackney. In terms of the farmers, there were a number of farmers that weren't able to come to the markets since pandemic because of safety issues, and also we did a whole readjustment of the farmers market to make it COVID safe. But interestingly or gratifyingly, the sales of the farmers that are coming are holding up, if not actually increasing. So that's really good to see. In terms of affordability and accessibility, I mean, the prices are generally less expensive than supermarket organic, but they're not as cheap as the pound of bowl shops. 20% of our members and our customers identify as being on low incomes. So we do our best to get leftover produce and uncollected produce to go to community partners, including several homeless and refugee projects. And when members from the box scheme go on holiday, they can donate the value of their bag to something we call our food credit scheme, and then we arrange to get fresh organic produce to our local food bank each week. And we also offer a pensioners discount and accept Healthy Start vouchers, although to be honest, the uptake of Healthy Start is really low and dropping. And we're looking to set up a more affordable sort of fair food or solidarity option next year. And ideally, we'd like to link this to a research project to evaluate how much that subsidy is worth in terms of health gains and other public goods. And we're still working through the details of that. We also do some of our own food growing. We have 9 small sites here in Hackney, which we call a patchwork farm, where we grow mainly salads. And then we have a larger mainly cupboard growing site in Dagenham, where we grow a wider range of produce. And through both projects, we do volunteering, a training program, and outreach work, although again, a lot of that has been put on hold as a result of the pandemic. In 2010, we started working on what we call our startup program, and we were able to help 11 other similar trading groups to get up and running, and they are now collectively known as the Better Food Traders Network. So Better Food Traders are retailers who trade mainly fresh fruit and veg produced by organic and agroecological farmers, and it's a mutually supportive peer-to-peer network which is expanding, and we're seeking out more retailers in order that we can tell their story and the story of the farmers they work with, and to help to increase demand for their produce and services. So if this does sound like you, then the website there, and I think there's hopefully be a link in the chat. I think it's probably fair to say that many of us, particularly in the cities, are massively disengaged from how our food is produced, and from the people that do this most important of work. We just don't see farmers. And I've just seen that slide, and I think it looks like we want to actually hunt them down, but that's not quite what we're intending. I wasn't intending with that slide. But anyway, these are some of the farmers that we work with. we've recently started to use this term Pharma Focus to describe the way we work and the routes to market we provide. And it's got a number of different elements to it, but there are two main elements I wanted to talk about now. The first is about, we want to make sure that the organic and agroecological farmers we trade with get more of, or in fact, most of the money in the supply chain. I mean, farmers received around 8% of the customer pound in the supermarket-driven system, and while in our system, they receive at least 56% or more of the customer pound. Or to look at it from a slightly different angle, we pay our farmers 80p or more per kilogram of potatoes, while the farm gate price for those potatoes is 15p or less a kilogram. I mean, I actually gave this example as evidence to a national food strategy workshop I attended last year. And I remember the Treasury economist who was there being frankly, nonplussed, possibly even appalled that we would voluntarily choose to pay more for something than the market actually dictated. And I explained that we paid more so that the farmers who produce those potatoes can farm ecologically and pay their workers fairly, and that we are paying the farmer for the public goods they provide, but that the system currently fails to reward. And we're also compensating for the fact that the 15p potatoes do not reflect the true cost of producing them. I mean, it remains to be seen what the national food policy, the national food strategy will come up with later this year in terms of supply chains, fairness, etc. But I mean, I think the bottom line is that if we want more climate and nature-friendly food production, we have to provide farmers with more of the money in the supply chain to enable them to do that. Okay, so that's the first sort of pretty critical element of Pharma Focus. The second element is around is the fact that we and other better food traders, we work hard to help our customers and members to eat seasonally and to make the food that our farmers are able to best produce throughout the year the core of their weekly food shop. So it's kind of in the spirit of something that I heard the farmer and author James Rebanks say recently, which was our diets should be shaped by what works for the land. So we work hard to help our customers appreciate this approach, or better still, to even see the creative potential of working within the limits that seasonality imposes on shopping and cooking habits. I mean, this is something that I don't know if people saw Rob Hopkins' imagination session, and he showed the food zones, which I'm just about to show you as well. But it talks about the possibility of flourishing within limits and being more creative within limits. Okay, so we try to take a balanced approach to trade too, as well as the limited approach. So while all the farmers we trade with are organic, as we think this is actually the best proxy to enable us to develop, to identify farmers who are farming in a climate and nature friendly way. But so while we look to everything to be that way, not everything we trade is local. So our approach to trade is represented by this diagram we call the food zones. So we start in the centre where we are in our urban area. We source as much as we can, as local as we can, and then we work outwards. So most of the food that we trade comes from what we call a rural hinterland here. So that's actually Kent, Essex and Norfolk. And we also source some from the peri-urban zone, which is our Dagenham farm, and some from our patchwork. We also do some wholesaling, particularly for fruit and for hungry gap veg. And we have the odd winter treat to have some contrast to the seasonal offerings of brassicas and roots that we're all enjoying at the moment. So, I mean, I think the wholesalers are often hidden in the stories we tell ourselves, while we kind of rhapsodize about the small farms that we trade with directly. And perhaps that's a little bit too much like this sort of supermarket, sort of fake farm on egg box kind of idea. So, wholesalers can be an important part of this more nuanced picture. And in fact, we've actually just recently set up our own wholesaling type operation called the Better Food Shed. It's perhaps not quite wholesale, it's more of a collaborative distributor. But anyway, we wanted to achieve two main things with it. We wanted to reduce the journeys and aggregate produce from the small farmers who were by then delivering to a whole number of multiple food traders operating in the London area. And we also wanted to be able to aggregate our buying power between all of us in London to be able to directly access some of the larger farmers that previously we'd only be able to get access to via a wholesaler, who we still work with because they're important to us, languages. So, and we're actually really quite excited to see how this closer relationship might result in these larger farmers feeling able to diversify what they grow in response to the customer base that we can offer them. Anyway, okay, that's me done for now. So I'm going to hand over to Christian to tell you more about the study itself. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Julie. So I'm just going to briefly give an overview of the findings of our analysis. So as Adrian introduced me, I'm from the New Economics Foundation. Part of what we do is evaluate practice, and what we did here is a social return on investment analysis of growing communities operations. And the way that we did this was we followed the following method. So we started with a theory of change session. We started with a theory of change session where we identified the following stakeholder groups. So we identified farmers, food producers, food eaters via the veg scheme, food eaters via the farmers market, and the environment as some of the key stakeholders who are affected by growing communities operations. We then mapped many of the outcomes that were affected, and we ended up including, I think, just less than 50 outcomes in our modeling. So outcomes, just for clarity, are defined as the change that occurs as a result of an activity taking place. So it could be improved emotional well-being of participants, or it could be carbon sequestered as a result of a type of activity. Then the next step in the method was to measure what changes. So to measure what changes as a result of growing communities operations that Julie's just described, we conducted several surveys. So we undertook a farmers market survey, we conducted a veg scheme customer survey, a farmers survey, a food processor survey, an employee survey, and then we also looked at growing communities' own financial data. In addition, when looking at the impact of farmers that are in growing community supply chain, we had to refer to existing research to talk about the impact of organic practices, organic farming practices, for instance. Then to value what changes, so that's bullet point number 3 in the method, we used financial proxies to monetize the improvements that we'd measured. And then it's important to move from gross change to net change. So what we mean by that is how much impact can we actually claim to be occurring as a result of what growing communities is doing. And this requires a consideration of the following. So dead weight is the first thing that we're required to consider. And that this is also known as the counterfactual. It represents the change in an outcome that would have occurred anyway for stakeholders in the absence of the involvement or existence of growing communities. So basically what would have happened anyway. Attribution, so not all of the change experienced by stakeholders may have been directly attributable to growing communities. So to remove the proportion of change that was caused by other factors occurring at the same time, we apply a percentage of attribution. And then displacement, which is relevant for some of the outcomes that we're looking at, is when an improvement in a certain outcome results in a displacement, i.e. an equivalent worsening of the same outcomes for other people or in other parts of the system. So basically we account for these factors to move from gross change to net change, which we call impact. And then based on that, we can calculate a cost-benefit ratio. And a cost-benefit ratio gives you the kind of return on investment that you might expect from spending £1 on growing communities operations. And we'll come on to that in a bit. So I will, so just to give you the headlines before we kind of delve into it a bit more. The key findings of the total impact of growing communities operations were that the operations generated an estimated 6.2 million in social, economic and environmental value in the 2019-2020 financial year. And so the greatest proportion of this, about 60%, went to veg scheme customers and their households, which we've termed veg scheme food eaters. The next largest share was for farmers market customers and their households, who received 1.6 million. The environment was the third largest recipient, with growing communities operations creating over £508,000 in value annually. And then farmers, employees and food processors received £312,000. So if we break down these findings per customer, and by customer we mean the person that buys the food, not necessarily each individual that consumes the food. So the average customer received £2,461 in benefits for them and their households, whilst generating £228 of value for the environment, £76 for farmers, £52 for employees of growing communities, and £13 for food processors. So those are the kind of high levels summary stats. Now I'll quickly run through some of the key value creating outcomes for these stakeholders. So in descending order, from largest to smallest, I'll start with the veg scheme food eaters. And so veg scheme customers reported eating an average of 92 fewer portions of meat and fish a year, while eating an average of 115 more portions of vegetables. So what we observed was healthier, often more plant-based diets with more fresh and seasonal food. In fact, 84% of veg scheme customers eat more seasonal produce since joining the scheme. What we also saw is that the VegBox scheme contributes to building customers' understanding of local and seasonal food. So over 60% of veg scheme customers say they know more about food and where it came from since joining. A similar proportion also said they understand seasonality better. We also see that buying food from the VegBox scheme changes customers' food waste habits. So cooking from scratch, eating less processed food, and becoming a more adventurous cook all contributed to a reduction of food waste. This was equivalent to about 33 portions a year on average. And then we also saw that buying from the VegBox scheme made people feel more connected to their communities. I mean, people go along to local pickup points to pick up their weekly veg bag, and 60% of growing communities customers reported feeling more involved in the food production network. So this translates into like the following value. So we see that veg scheme customers reported that improvements in their general perceived health were the most significant outcome affected by the growing community's operations. So you can see, per customer, £1,344 worth of value is generated there. The value, and what's interesting is also like the value of health improvements were more significant than the value of the food received. So the value of the food received is £641. The social element of the veg scheme is estimated to create £310 in social interactions and £60 in the sense of community for veg scheme members. Members also save £259 worth of time by not shopping in a supermarket as much. So, I mean, even though these numbers may come across as oddly specific, but they're just averages, and that's kind of where the numbers fall. So, but they give you a sense of the scale of change that's being driven by growing communities operations. So next I'll talk about the customers and food eaters, as we call them, who shop at the farmers market. So we find similar results, but slightly different results to those who consume via the veg box. So we also find that shopping at the farmers market supports healthier, more plant-based diets. Nearly 50% of people who shop at growing communities farmers market report knowing more about seasonal produce, where it comes from, to the extent that it's positively changing their eating habits. we see that it increases awareness of seasonality and the provenance of food. So 55% of people who shop at growing communities farmers market report feeling more in touch with their local food and their local food community. And as a result, people feel more connected to their local food network. In fact, we also see that we observed a 15 percentage point increase in participants feeling part of their local community. So now looking at the value that this translates to, we see that the value of the food received for farmers market customers was actually greater than the value of the health improvements, which is the opposite way around for compared to veg box customers. But this finding is kind of consistent with the less veg-based nature of the market, as well as the fact that going to the farmers market on a weekly basis is perhaps less of a consumption commitment than receiving the veg bag each week, in the sense that it's more of an opt-in. You opt in to go to the farmers market each week rather than opting out of the veg bag. And so perhaps it's unsurprising that we see less pronounced dietary changes being reported, which may be what's driving these lower changes in perceived general health improvements, I should say. But still, I mean, still pretty substantial. Though the farmers market sees a larger number of people gather than at the veg scheme collection points, the social benefits of the farmers market is slightly smaller, creating an estimated £245 in value in social interactions and £74 in a sense of community per customer. Additional value was also created in terms of improved knowledge of food and reduced food waste. So now I'll move on to the next stakeholder group, or stakeholder, I should say, which is just what we kind of categorize as the environment. And so what we see is that localized food networks that support organic farming contribute to fewer greenhouse gases. So we observed that lower greenhouse gases are enabled by growing communities operations through several routes. And this includes the production side, for example, through reduced use of synthetic fertilizers, as well as on the demand side, where, for instance, we see customers adopting more vegetable-based diets. We also observe that as a result of farming practices, organic farming practices within growing community supply chain, that nitrogen surpluses have been found to be 40 to 50% lower on organic farms than non-organic farms, meaning that reduced nitrogen leaches into the water tables. So based on this secondary analysis, this pre-existing research, I should say, we also estimate that the similar impacts are being observed in growing communities' supply chain. Of course, organic farming also excludes the use of all herbicides and almost all pesticides and fungicides. And as a result, the urban food networks that pump more money towards these practices have a positive impact on biodiversity and soil health. So one study that we reviewed found that the number of arable plant species on organic farms was 95% higher than on conventional farms. And that there were nearly 80% more earthworms on organic farms. There are higher numbers and more species of birds, and the same goes for insect pollinators on organic farms. So we reviewed many outcomes for this, and I'll just show you the top 10 most valuable ones, because they didn't all fit on the chart otherwise, I'm afraid. And so what we found is that growing communities work supports significant environmental impacts, the largest of which was improved levels of carbon sequestered within the soil, which is estimated to be worth around $413,000 per year. It's important to note there's actually quite considerable uncertainty around this estimate, because the benefits, the annual benefits, if you like, the amount of carbon sequestered each year, stabilize after a period of time after organic farming approaches have been adopted. But nonetheless, this is what we felt was a reasonable estimate of that value. If we categorize environmental benefits into either supply chain benefits or consumer behavior and packaging benefits, we find that the vast majority of the value created by growing communities derives from the supply chain rather than the consumer side. We see that £478,500 of environmental benefit is created through more environmentally friendly farming practices, and shifting patterns of consumer behaviour result in additional value worth £29,700. Another thing that's interesting to note is that the environmental benefits of organic farming in the supply chain that we've monetized here exceed the yield foregone. So as a result of adopting organic farming practices, existing research suggests that the yield, the amount of food produced per hectare, is lower. And so when we estimated this based on the type of land within the supply chain and so on, and compared it to the benefits of organic farming, we found that the benefits equated to £478,000, whilst the yield foregone equated to £106,000, suggesting that organic farming is preferable to conventional methods, and even before considering wider factors such as health and well-being. I'll now move on to the next stakeholder group, so farmers. So dealing directly with farmers cuts waste is one of the key findings. So a third of farmers surveyed said that they produce less waste as a result of working directly with growing communities. And this kind of partnership-focused buying policy that Julie explained promotes the financial well-being and job security for small-scale farmers. So 42% of farmers surveyed reported meaningful improvements in their financial well-being, whilst 26% reported improved job security. A partnership-focused buying policy also leads to increased turnover for farmers. So 85% reported increased sales growth, with sales increasing by an average of 87% since working with growing communities. On average, farms reported employing 4 more people since working with growing communities. And they also felt more appreciated, and this really came out. So 85% of farmers who are part of growing communities network report that they felt their work was more appreciated. And we see this when we account for net impact and we monetize the outcomes. We see that the greatest benefit created for farmers is the well-being benefit of feeling that their work was more appreciated. And this was closely followed by the impact of managing better financially and feeling more secure in their job. The value of reduced pressure to scale up their operations was also significant at £625 per farmer, as was the increased autonomy over what they can produce. The next stakeholder group that I mentioned in the intro was employees. So these are direct employees of growing communities. So as Julie mentioned, growing communities employs over 30 people on a part-time basis, paying all staff at least the real living wage, London living wage, I should say, and capping maximum pay at twice this. 14 members of staff at growing communities report that they have been able to look after their children for an average of 7 hours a week, extra hours a week. So the flexible family-friendly employment provided by growing communities seems to be translating into a total of 375 hours a year, additional care time for parents who work at growing communities. Growing community staff report a total annual change in travel time of 230 hours a year, costing £141. And this kind of reflects the fact that growing communities has a model of localized, neighborhood-oriented approach to food distribution. And so for the people who work at growing communities, it reduces the time that they have to travel. Again, looking at the value that this translates into, we see that the most significant value created by growing communities for its employees is to enable them to manage better financially. This benefit is worth an estimated £1,077 per employee. The residential-centric nature of employment, which reduces commuting time, was the next most valuable contribution for employees, worth an average of £994 in time and £45 in costs, I should say, per annum. So the value of the time saved is the real value add here. And then reduced childcare costs were also significant at £868 per employee. Lastly, I'll cover the food processors. So the food processors are the people who make things like cakes and hot food and sell them at the market. And we distinguish them from the farmers who show up at the farmers market as well. So we find that trading at the farmers market offers rewards for local food processors. So 67% of food processors reported increased turnover since attending the farmers market in Stoke Newington. These stall holders report employing an average of 5 more people since attending the farmers market. And we see that it can really help them grow their businesses. So 71% of stall holders cite that the support they received from growing communities was one of the primary reasons that their businesses have become self-sustaining. And so breaking down their outcomes that we were able to capture and monetize, we see that the support offered from growing communities and other stall holders at the market was estimated to be worth over £1,000 per year to food processors. The improvement in financial well-being was markedly less than for farmers, at £436 per capita, compared to the £1,820 I showed on an earlier slide. I think that finding is quite interesting in and of itself, and perhaps reflective of the extent to which growing communities operations affects the trading environment for the two groups. So Julie was explaining with the farmers, where they're really getting a much larger slice of the pie than they would be trading in other avenues. And perhaps the change is a little less radical for the food processors. So the value of being part of a social group was greater, though, for food processors than it was for farmers or consumers. So perhaps just telling them the amount of support that they felt they received. So that's the breakdown. Coming back to the top level summary of the findings, our analysis estimates that growing communities generated 6.2 million in economic, commercial, social, and environmental value in 2019-20 from £1.6 million worth of costs, and that includes opportunity costs. So what I mean by opportunity costs really is just the yield foregone, so the reduced amount of food produced per hectare as a result of organic practices being adopted. And this resulted in an overall cost-benefit ratio of 3.73 pounds of value generated for each pound of costs. So when Julie was talking about what I said in an earlier email about growing communities being more efficient than industrialized agriculture, this is what she's referring to. This is it. So it's the £3.73 of value generated for each pound of costs, or each pound invested, let's say. And just to contextualize this a bit, actually before that I should add that the cost-benefit ratio remains high even when the focus is just on food eaters, so just on people who receive growing communities food. So for each pound spent by consumers, they and their households receive an additional £2.46 in benefit, which is quite something. So yeah, to contextualize it, we see that growing communities, I've looked at other similar types of analyses, and these types of analyses tend to be conducted for charitable organizations or governmental organizations. They don't tend to be conducted for commercial enterprises, where the assumption is that externalities of production are less of a concern. But what we see here is that growing communities' cost benefit ratio is relatively high, and I mean, it's less than like the existential almost intervention of fire brigade services, but it's still substantially higher than other charitable organizations, which is pretty telling for a commercial, and quite surprising, I should say, rather, for a commercial activity. So to conclude, we find that growing communities is a highly efficient method of food distribution, and as I've just explained, really. So we also find that it's primarily a social intervention, but it's also an environmental one. So the vast majority of benefit accrues to consumers and their households, and they receive an estimated 87% of total benefits. And then for every pound spent, they receive £3.46 of the economic and social value generated as a result, with the environment being the next biggest beneficiary, receiving 32p. So another conclusion really is that by utilizing these short supply chains and by working in partnership with farmers, growing communities is able to redistribute economic power to farmers, providing them with the financial security to generate considerable social value for themselves and even greater benefits for the environment. So as Julie said at the off, it's by empowering farmers, by supporting them, that we're able to generate these environmental externalities, which benefit all of us ultimately. And then this is all achieved while offering consumers a product that we estimate returns them an additional £2.46 for every pound they spend. So yeah, it's a vote of confidence in growing communities overall. So I'll now hand back to Adrian to kind of talk a little about next steps and yeah, any other thoughts.
Great, Christian. Julie, thank you very much for your presentations. And I think it was really important that Christian was able to go into a lot of the detail behind the findings, to explain how much work went into this and how thorough the investigation was. Our findings would have been even more dramatic had a methodology been established for evaluating more of the environmental impacts. We'd hoped and expected such a methodology and value sets would have emerged from DEFRA during the course of developing the ELM scheme. International consultants were engaged to achieve this, but their findings have not been made publicly available. So as Christian said, the impact of higher biodiversity and the impact of soil health have not been taken into account yet. So there's more work in progress to be done on this, and obviously it's a huge impact to the whole of the farming sector, food and farming sector, in relation to the transition towards ELMS. Secondly, another limitation was the impact of the pandemic, which meant that there had to be a little drawback on some of the areas that Julie talked about earlier in her presentation. And perhaps, Julie, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, well, in terms of our volunteer program and our trainee work, we had to put that on hold at the beginning of the pandemic. I mean, we've started to invite some people back to the sites, although obviously we're now in sort of mega lockdown again. So it wasn't possible to get enough data in relation to that area of work to include it.
And that would have made a bigger impact in terms of community benefits, presumably, yeah. Christian.
Oh yeah, sorry, Christian.
Yeah, for sure, exactly. But we didn't include the costs that relate to that either. So I won't commit to saying which way it would have shifted the SROI ratio or CBA ratio.
Okay, so I think there are other areas which points to further work, particularly in relation to the sourcing policy in terms of geographical location that growing communities have engaged in, and more work needs to be done analysing the options for organic farmers seeking to be fairly rewarded for the public goods that they deliver on farm, and also to help inform people the most effective ways that they can support organic farmers and agroecological farmers through their purchase of food. However, our findings do clearly still demonstrate that as a society we have a problem that urgently needs to be fixed, not just in the context of climate change, but also that the human cost of the failure of our food prices to reflect its wider value and impact. And this research paper ably demonstrates the failure in this area. This information needs to be spread far and wide, so please do share it. The report is going to be made available in the spring. I think, Julie, do you have any date for when this report will be?
We don't. No, we haven't decided the actual date yet, but we wanted to we were thinking of launching it right now, but we didn't think this was the right time. So we thought we'd look for a better date because we didn't want to sort of squander the results, attempt to get some decent coverage on it. But yes, in the next couple of months, definitely.
Right, and then we will be publicising that through Soil Association of all channels to make sure that this work is going to reach the widest possible audience. We're going to disseminate it through the Soil Association to Organic Farming News also. So just there have been quite a few questions coming through, and I think we probably should ask those. So this is one for Julie. Do you think the growing communities model could work in other parts of the country and indeed the world? I'm thinking of community-supported agriculture, farms and growers coming together to sell and make food accessible, but many are rural and not near towns.
Yes. Short answer.
Okay.
The short answer is some of the other better food traders that we help set up are actually working in other parts of the country. So we have a veg bag people in Manchester, and we have a group in Burnley, and we're also inviting other better food traders from Sheffield and Glasgow and various other places. They're using similar models. It's not exactly the same. We wouldn't expect it to be exactly the same. So yes, I do think it is, and also we're talking to the CSA network because it is it's a different model, but essentially in terms of being farmer focused and basically those elements of getting more money to farmers, seeing farmers, supporting farmers who are farming in a climate and nature friendly way, then absolutely. But yes, the locations make a big difference in terms of where the populations are. Where the people eating, where the people eat, not the people eaters, the produce eaters, where the food eaters are, is obviously makes a practical difference to how different models are going to work. But I mean, Better Food Trade is hoping to bring all of those models together, with the underlying principles being what are common, and we might be logistically and practically doing different sorts of things on the ground.
Okay, so thank you. There's another question, which I think probably directed more for Christian, but also to Julie. Is there also a potential local healthcare cost benefit? If local healthcare services are being used less because of the growing communities, then that would be quite a thing.
Well, yes, is the answer. But is it captured in our modelling? No, I'm afraid. So we have captured the health benefits to the individual in terms of the value, just in terms of kind of like well-being value that translates into in quality of life value. But we haven't been able to capture it in kind of impact on the state finances. We haven't been able to capture that outcome. But it's not beyond the realms of this type of analysis to be able to do so. In fact, there's quite a lot of longitudinal type analysis that looks at the relationship between health markers and then how often you go to the GP, for instance, or how often you end up in hospital. So it would be something that it would be interesting to kind of put some numbers on and continue to look into going forward.
I mean, certainly when we were looking, when we were first given the idea of public payment for public goods, and then the DEFRA consultation was on health and harmony, linking food and health directly, it did seem as though there might be some sort of cross-departmental thinking going on within government on this very area. And I think now, it's very apparent that there's a huge amount of gain for everybody to be made by making this sense of connection. So would you feel that a future piece of work integrating that, the two halves, so to speak, of what you've done and what that modelling is suggesting would be something which would be even more striking?
Well, it would add to the benefit side, but it wouldn't change the cost side, would it? So it would just add to the economic efficiency of what's going on here, really. And when you think a GP appointment costs the state an average of, I think, around £150 each, and inpatient care rockets up in terms of costs, it doesn't take much to translate marginal improvements in health into big state savings. So there's certainly a case to be made there for linking up that thinking.
I mean, I think it was one of the elements that I was alluding to when I was talking about us wanting to set up a fair food or a lower income VAT. What we'd really like to do is actually be able to do a project that links an actual practical. We're getting we're basically selling a bag of produce for less, but then also trying to show what the value of that difference in prices in terms of health, health benefits and other public goods things. Because it's just to say that this is a very particular way of doing an analysis. It's just one way of looking at things. This isn't, it ends up skewing things in a certain way. And obviously there are loads of things that you can't measure and you can't value and you might not want to value. But it's just a way of seeing it, of one particular of many ways of seeing it. I don't know why I started on that. Probably because I saw something in the chat. Right. Which was saying how or why would you be valuing this? And it's sometimes we are coming, Christy and I used to go, well, honestly, biodiversity, that how can you value it? It's we're doing it to make a point, but obviously there are so many things that you can't really put a value on it. And that's what I was sort of alluding to at the beginning, saying, definitions of efficiency and whatever, and maybe this isn't even, it's not really the way that maybe we should be talking about things, but this is one way of talking about it that is going to appeal, hopefully, to policymakers. We can make a case with policymakers. And also we really wanted to be able to to let our customers know, because and our members, because the members of the people who are on the box scheme are members of the organisation as well, of the great, what value they're getting, and what they're creating through, the food choices that they're making. I'm looking at the chat, Adrian, so I'm seeing the questions. So I think that I don't know whether I'm flipping ahead into answering something.
There are two link questions for you, Julia, around on the same theme. Do you make a distinction between organic farming and agroecological farming? If so, what is it? And then you say you use organic growers. Doesn't organic certification cost a lot and exclude very small producers who may be growing agroecologically? They're both quite big questions, but whether you want to...
Yeah, it's a can of worms. The can of worms has been opened up on various other sessions as well, but I will absolutely attempt to answer it, which is that, do we make a distinction between organic and agroecological? We make a distinction in as much as one of them's got something that you can that's a legally certifiable, externally validated standard, and the other one isn't. So as retailers, we want to use we want to have as many verifiable producers, working with as many producers that clearly meet that standard as we can. But we also absolutely recognise that for small scale organic producers who are are producing organically or agroecologically, whichever word you want to, that are not certified, it's really hard. It's really difficult for some of those small producers, and we are actively working with the Soil Association at the moment to talk to them about the fact that, for instance, our patchwork farm, which is on, is tiny. We pay nearly, we pay £500 to £1,000 certification fees for that, and we'd rather not. But so. And as part of the Better Food Traders Network, we're absolutely trying to deal with this issue. So we're trying to go through it, come at it from an angle of transparency. So for instance, if you are growing your own food and you are retailing the own food and you are saying that it's agroecological and organic, then it's kind of like, okay, fair enough. So we don't do that with our own sites, because we would set them up 25 years ago, which I can't really believe it's that long ago. And we had a point to prove. So we wanted them to be the first sites in, that were organic. We wanted them, it wasn't even known at that point. So, but we're talking to the Soil Association about whether it does make sense for us to keep those tiny sites as, certified. So we're up for the issues of agroecology and regenerative and all of these terms. I think that in many ways there are elements of those definitions that are better than organic, but for us we need a foundation of something that's externally validated, and for us currently the best proxy is organic certification. But like I say, Better Food Traders is working within that to try to allow for the fact that for very small producers, that's incredibly hard. And for people that are literally working side by side with people, then it's like, fair enough, trust. So, we're using a balanced approach to it. Does that answer the question?
I think that's answers it for now. I'm sure the Zoom, we can bring it up again when we move to the Zoom. We have the option to move to Zoom in the next couple of minutes. I think we'll just do one more question. It's just a technical one for Christian. If you could just spend perhaps a minute or so just on this one, and then I think we'll just close up and move on to Zoom. So the question is, Christian, when you say that increased soil carbon is worth 413,000, worth that amount to who? It is a good thing, but how and why do you assign monetary value to these items? I can also answer. Yeah, you've got. Go ahead.
Sure. So it's worth that much annually to society as a whole, and that value is kind of determined by, we're building on pre-existing research here, which has estimated the social cost of carbon. So per ton of carbon in the atmosphere, given the implications of climate warming and so on, and the implications of that on human existence, and the costs associated with having to adjust to climate change, then what is the cost to all of us as a result of more carbon in the atmosphere? And so by sequestering carbon, there's a benefit that's generated there, and the benefit is that 413,000.
I think the underlying figures, we're looking at the carbon trading permits at a value of £20 per carbon dioxide emission tons.
Adrian, we're actually looking at the social cost of carbon, which is higher and more inclusive than just the trading permits.
Okay.
Just because we felt it was a more accurate representation of the actual value being created than simply what's found on the market, and that's in fact what government recommends you use. So.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you very much for that. So I'm just going to close up just to reiterate that this report is coming out in the spring. The information needs to be spread far and wide. People have to know that they can both help themselves, their families, and communities just through the act of buying food in a different way. And that change will flow right back to the farmland upon which we all ultimately depend and benefit everyone through that action. So I'm going to close. I'd like to thank Christian for his presentation, and Julie also. And it's been great working with you on this project. And I think you have done very well today, and hopefully answered everybody's questions in a satisfactory manner. Anybody who wants to carry on and talk further, because there are some issues raised around diet, which we can go into in the Zoom room, then please follow us into that. So we're going to sign off now and move to the Zoom. Thank you.